So the big question is, what should we be doing now, or what should you be doing now? One thing to remember is that some of these problems will go away of their own accord, and that's what the Peninsula farmers were at this time last year facing similar questions. Should we bait or should we wait? And for many of them who waited, that was the right decision. Proactive baiting will usually be effective unless you've got a recognisable source of seed out there that the mice are using. And the decision of whether or not you go out there now and bait now to protect crops where you know you've got some mice, but they're not doing much damage yet, is all going to depend on how risk averse you are and how much time you have available to monitor developing damage. Crops are extremely vulnerable shortly after seeding, but although some damage does occur in the vegetative stages, the next phase where they are extremely vulnerable is when the heads start to develop or flowering and potting in pulses and canola. So you may get away with sitting around waiting for a while to see what happens, and it's going to depend whether you've got time to watch out. And what you need to watch out for is, first of all, the damage in developing tillers. Now, although it's not commonly severe, it sometimes is. And we've seen this particularly in durum wheats up around Crystal Brook, back in 2002, where they had almost no problems at seeding. And come August, I had a call from an agronomist up there saying, we've just had a look at a paddock out there that's got big brown patches in it. We thought it was moisture stress, but we think now it's mice. Can you come up and have a look? And sure enough it was. Mice were chewing into the base of the tillers, just taking out the growing point, and the plant just falls over. So until you pick it up and have a look underneath, it looks like some sort of disease. And when you had a look at these plants, you were seeing that there was a tiller which had been damaged very early and was withered and lying on the ground, another one which was damaged a little higher up the stem and had sort of fallen over and was yellow, and then there was another one that had just been damaged, it was fallen over, it was still green, that was damaged higher up again, and another tiller had taken over as the predominant tiller, and they ended up baiting thousands of hectares from the air to prevent this damage, which once they got up in the air and looked around, turned out to be extremely widespread. So it can happen, keep an eye out for it. Canola damage is more apparent if you get out there and walk around in the crop. And in particular, look out in those crops that were planted early and got away well, because they may have got away well before the mice changed from searching for seed on the ground to digging up what's been planted. There could still be mice out there, and I have in the past seen this, that some early planted crops that get away really well then get smashed when they get to the later stages. Monitoring the actual mouse numbers in the crop is extremely difficult in advancing crops because visibility is just greatly reduced is the primary thing. And I believe you're much better off if you are planning to play a waiting game to look out for damage to your crop rather than to try and assess changes in the mouse population itself. However, if you have the time and interest in doing that, go to the GRDC website or the Animal Control Technologies website. There are a variety of methods you can use for attempting to monitor mice in crops, which do generally work. The one caveat I would say is using bait cards, little pieces of paper or card soaked in canola oil and measuring the amount consumed by mice tends not to work in the spring. I found it's very reliable around seeding when there's not much other seed source around, but when the crops start maturing, it tends to be eaten by snails and not much else. So, conclusion. Talking to landholders last year, there's a general consensus amongst the West Coasters that stubble retention increases mouse problems. Weed control is really critical, and those people who still have mixed farming enterprises with livestock in them are having less problems with mice than those who own cropping only. But there is very clearly a great and increasing reliance on mouse baiting to retain all the benefits of minimum till. And my own conclusion from looking at this over the last 12 months again is that although better baiting strategies are going to be an important part of the picture, there need to be new strategies to develop to reduce grain loss at harvest to protect all the other benefits of minimum till and stubble retention. CSIRO spent some time in the 80s and early 90s looking at diseases in mice. Now, I wasn't part of that research, but as I understand it, their general conclusions were that most of these diseases that might be useful are reasonably widespread through mouse populations in Australia and only flare up at the end of plagues because the conditions for transmission are appropriate. To take the analogy with rabbit diseases, there's been quite a lot of work done with looking at introducing mixed mitosis into populations to help aid rabbit control. And by and large, what they found was that if you introduced it and it spread, you'd find out it was breaking up naturally all around you anyway. And most of the time when you introduced it, it just went nowhere because the conditions weren't right for it to spread. You know, these diseases tend to be out there and active whenever the conditions are right, and they concluded that there wasn't anything to be gained. They did look at one nematode disease, spent quite a lot of time working on a thing called capillaria to try and use it to do, as you say, to bring about a crash earlier on. But what they found was that they couldn't get it to spread rapidly enough to actually advance the crash. Another problem with looking for new diseases is that there are native mice that are closely related to the house mouse, and there'd be some distinct limitations on what you could introduce and use because of the effect on native fauna. No, so I think what had happened was you know, guys had harvested and then had a look around it and perhaps seen a lot of mice harvest and thought what they were going to do. Some of them had deliberately then gone out and run over the whole property with a prickle chain to knock it all down. I only spoke to a couple of blokes who'd done that. Others had gone out with a stone rolling, just do some stone rolling on stony patches. And then when they came to seeding and found they had very few mice in those patches where they'd run over with a stone roller. And that had been an unexpected consequence of their actions. A couple of blokes had a fire go through a few properties in summer, and those paddocks that got burned, because it was a very hot fire, it took out the grain that was lying on the ground, whereas a fire going through in April, burning less hot, tends to sort of toast the barley rather than destroy it, and makes relatively little difference. So there were a few people who in 2010 had deliberately gone out and knocked down stubbles. Whether or not more of them this year have gone out and deliberately done that or harvested lower, I don't know. I haven't gone back to ask them about, you know, having found out that this seemed to have a big impact, who's changed their practices. I know there's a lot more burning going on, and of course that's something which most of us would consider to be an undesirable change. The answer is we really don't know, but there is some concern that's been expressed in South Australia by the farmers over the last 12 months, whether by using bait and knocking populations down, they're just trimming the population down to a level where it's not going to crash to extremely low levels. Possibly. What's happened in the past is we've seen these big crashes, and in the subsequent years, mouse numbers have been lower than you might expect based on the average seasonal conditions in those years. That the effect of a crash in populations was not only immediate but lasted for a couple of seasons before numbers recovered to more normal levels. Now, it's possible that was because mice were over-exploiting food resources, taking out persistent seeds like medic and the like, that were critical for them to get through winter periods in subsequent years, and it took a while for some of those persistent weed and pasture seeds to build up in the soil to a level where they could carry them through. The other possibility is that it is disease that was critical, and that in that big population crash, diseases became so well established through the population that it took a couple of years for the disease prevalence to drop away to the level that might more normally have been. And that was what was preventing mice from rising up to normal levels for a couple of years. Now, if it's all tied up with the food availability thing, I think it's possible that we've changed farming systems so much now that we might actually be creating a situation where a mouse plague could persist for 2-3 years, whereas previously 18 months and usually there's a big crash and it all went away. If it's a disease thing, I think that there have been sufficient populations have reached high enough levels that there should be very high disease prevalence through the population at the moment, and that will spread from, if you have trimmed the population in one area, it's still likely to be that having widespread disease through populations in the district will spread through, I think. My feeling is that it's likely there is going to be some very severe damage in some crops if further baiting is not done. Now, that's likely to be quite variable between districts, and the best guide we've got, I think, is what happened in 1993, because 92-93 was very, very similar season to what we've just had in South Australia, at least, where we had a lot of crop damage around harvest in 92, on top of a very high crop growth year, so there were high potential yields and then a lot of damage, and then a lot of summer weeds, and a big plague in autumn and winter 93. Now, we did not have any registered bait available at the beginning of seeding that year, but Stricken was made available sort of in the middle of seeding. We saw then, so June there was nothing available and people were seeding. July, Stricken was available. We had a big stack, about 150 tonnes of bait used. July there was virtually none. In August there was another 140 tonnes of used when the crops started running up. I suspect if we'd had Stricken available in June, it might have been 2/3 of it used in around seeding and 1/3 of it used at crop maturation. And then after about September there was virtually none used again, because any crop that had really severe problems in September that wasn't treated was gone. So you were past the phase where the mice were doing the worst of their damage. If that can be taken as a guide, I suspect that we might see something like a third or a half of the area that was treated at seeding will be treated across southern Australia during spring. Now it might be a lot less than that, because having had bait available means that a greater proportion of infested paddocks were treated at seeding. And it's going to be highly variable, I suspect, from region to region. In that 93 plague on Eyre Peninsula, there was a massive bait used at seeding, very little used around crop maturation, whereas in the eastern part of South Australia, in the Murray Mallee, there was relatively little used around seeding and a mass used around crop maturation. So you get these sort of major regional differences. But I've heard enough landholders saying to me that they believe they still have a lot of mice out in their paddocks, and they're very concerned about damage in this maturation phase. Last year, we had very few crops treated on the Peninsula after seeding. So that was the main period when damage occurred. But close to Adelaide and the lower north area, there were thousands of hectares, particularly canolas and potting, that had bait flown on, where they had very good crop establishment with little damage, and then there were enough mice there that they really stepped into it when the plot started to develop.
Thanks very much, Greg. We'll have to wind the questions up now. Thanks very much.